Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon in this great hall, and the blend of old and new, I think, is very fitting as we come together to talk about FinTech. And as chair of the Treasury Select Committee in the House of Commons, I devote a lot of time to holding people and organisations to account, to scrutinising decisions and calling out bad practice. But today, don't worry, let me start with a bit of praise. The UK's FinTech sector is a success story, though one in its early history. It's one that's obviously attracting attention from around the world, and I've no doubt that today and tomorrow you'll be inundated with facts and figures demonstrating how far the UK's FinTech sector has come. So for that reason, I'm not intending to bombard you with lots of statistics, not least because in this room are the very people behind all those numbers. And you probably don't need to be reminded of the contribution that FinTech is making to the UK economy. Now, the UK is held up as the best place in the world to create, to grow, and to invest in FinTech companies. And the government has expressed a determination to ensure that that continues to be the case. And I know that you've heard from the Minister, John Glenn, earlier on today. But of course, as you know, doing so won't necessarily be straightforward. And one needn't look far to see burgeoning FinTech sectors in other jurisdictions. So I wanted to talk about three particular challenges today, but I also want to welcome today's announcement of the establishment of the FinTech Strategy Group, which is going to be industry-led and to work with parties of all interests to flesh out some of the issues that government perhaps hasn't focused on to date. So what's the first challenge for the sector? Well, clearly regulation. Regulation builds trust. Without it, consumers and businesses may be much more hesitant when it comes to adopting the innovative and disruptive products being developed by the FinTech sector. Now, without wanting to overgeneralize, it's interesting to draw a comparison between the FinTech sector's approach to regulation and that taken by the large incumbent players in the financial services market. Now, in Westminster, we are often lobbied by large financial services firms for looser and more accommodating regulation. Compliance is costly, and existing regulation can be restrictive, they tell us. Yet over the last few years, the mood music from the FinTech sector has been markedly different. There has been a desire for regulation in recognition of the fact that customers attract a lot of weight to the credibility and protection that regulation brings. And in the peer-to-peer lending space, the lenders themselves even introduced a self-regulatory regime as a precursor to the sector being brought within the Financial Conduct Authority's remit. Now, when it comes to the regulation of FinTech, the FCA is regarded as being at the forefront of global thinking. Its pragmatic and supportive approach has, for the most part, allowed the sector to flourish. But what exactly is the challenge facing the UK when it comes to the regulation of FinTech? Well, let me set out three particular thoughts. Of course, firstly, there's the balance between adequately protecting customers whilst not stifling innovation. And as the sector develops, so too do the risks it poses. Regulation has to be suitably dynamic and adaptable, particularly for a sector in which the pace of change can be staggering. Also, of course, important is the international dimension of FinTech regulation. Different jurisdictions, as you will know, are competing fiercely to attract FinTech firms and investment. And this, of course, has implications for the United Kingdom. But, of course, we don't think we should be dragged into a race to the bottom when it comes to regulatory standards, not least because, as I've already mentioned, effective regulation is good for the sector. And then, of course, whilst other countries are learning from the UK's FinTech sector, we can, of course, learn from other jurisdictions. The FCA's recently signed agreement with the US Commodity Futures Trading Commission on FinTech collaboration is a positive step and should provide a useful bridge across the Atlantic. So what's your second challenge? Well, access to capital, I'd suggest. Just like their peers in other markets, FinTech firms need to attract investment in order to grow. Figures on investment to date in the UK FinTech firms are promising, and yet we hear wide-ranging estimates of the size of the funding gap faced by UK SMEs across all sectors. The problem is particularly pronounced for those companies looking to capitalise on their initial success and startup, and those looking to scale up. The companies with the highest potential for growth are perhaps looking to expand overseas. And as the UK's FinTech sector reaches a certain level of maturity, There'll be many firms within it that fit this description. So we have to make sure that our capital markets are serving these companies and allowing them to realise their potential. Now, the Treasury Committee, which I have the great privilege of chairing, is conducting an inquiry at the moment into SME finance. Now, that isn't focused on fintech firms particularly, but it is examining the overall issue of how our SMEs get finance and exploring the extent to which fintech could be a part of the solution. So I hope very much if you have opinions on that, you will submit them to the inquiry. Now, I suggest that the third particular challenge for the sector is attracting global talent. We know that the right skills can often be hard to find, particularly in areas such as coding and software development. And of course, Brexit is going to have a bearing on the ease with which companies in the UK can tap into pools of talent throughout the EU. Now, this issue of recruiting and finding enough talent is something that the Treasury Select Committee is also examining. We're holding an evidence session on EU migration next Tuesday, during which we'll hear from a range of experts. And longer term, we keenly await both the outcome of the Migration Advisory Committee's work on the costs and benefits of European migrants to the UK economy and the government's immigration white paper and then a bill later on this year. I want to talk about diversity for a moment because, of course, that's another important element in terms of finding the right talent for your businesses. And I know that's a big part of today's conference. I also want to congratulate all the organisers because I understand that you haven't got any all-male panels here today. So I think that is a significant achievement. But gender diversity in the broader financial service industry is something, again, that the Treasury Committee has been closely examining over the past few months through our Women in Finance inquiry. Both the evidence that the committee has received through the inquiry and the gender pay gap numbers that are currently being published in the run-up to the 5th of April deadline make it abundantly clear that there is significant work to be done in order to improve female representation at senior levels in our financial services sector. Now, we've already drawn a number of conclusions, although the inquiry is still ongoing, and there are some important themes that are emerging, and I suspect that many of you will recognise all of these themes. Firstly, it's clear that diversity pays. Improving gender diversity is good for firms' bottom lines. Secondly, there is no doubting that cultural issues are key. Many women say that the culture in financial services discourages them from seeking to take on senior roles in the sector. Third, I think we have to recognise that there are unconscious biases at play. There is a need to tackle stereotypes and assumptions about what is required for leadership and success in financial services. Achieving change on this front will not happen overnight. And finally, transparency is essential for driving change. As Jaynan Gadia, who is the Chief Executive of Virgin Money, who was behind the Women in Finance Charter adopted by the Treasury, and she gave evidence to our committee last year, she said, "What gets measured gets done." Shining a spotlight on diversity issues is critical for pushing them up the agenda, as I say we've seen with the gender pay gap reporting. And I should make clear, of course, we're talking about gender diversity here, but there are many other forms of diversity, which I strongly suspect that the financial services sector, along with many other sectors, including my own of politics, absolutely need to focus on. Now, while the fintech sector is often at pains to emphasise the extent to which it differs from the traditional financial service sector, and as I say, I think you've demonstrated that with your panels at this event, we have to recognise that fintech isn't immune to problems with female representation. Data from 2017 shows that only 17% of senior executives in UK fintech are women. So as with the wider financial services sector, as I say, with many other sectors, including Westminster, we all have work to do. But I know that diversity is very much on the agenda at this year's Innovate Finance Global Summit, and this evening's event on closing the gender gap in fintech and tomorrow's workshop on gender parity in the workplace will, I'm sure, generate fascinating discussions. And it's also promising to see the steps being taken by the fintech sector to improve gender diversity across the sector. The publication of Innovate Finance's Women in FinTech Power List, for example, shows just how big an impact women are having in the world of fintech and can hopefully inspire more women to pursue a fintech career. I want to see that list getting bigger every year. Just before I move on to the work of the Treasury Select Committee in relation to FinTech, I mentioned the word careers there. And as you'd expect from a former Secretary of State for Education, I'm passionate about great education and great schools, but also great inspiration. And I think one of the challenges probably for FinTech, because you are such a success, is how do we translate that to young people up and down the country who may not live in London, who may not know anything about FinTech, but who might make great future employees for all of you. So I'd urge you as a sector to think about how we're going to inspire the next generation and to take any opportunity you can to go and talk to young people in schools and colleges. You might not appreciate what great role models you actually are for the next generation, but they will be bowled over to hear from you. Now, where does the Treasury Select Committee fit in relation to FinTech? Well, it is a topic of great interest to the Treasury Committee, and it's a theme that one way or another permeates almost the entire spectrum of the committee's work. From FinTech innovation that improves the financing options available to SMEs, as I said, to the various ways in which it can help to tackle issues with debt and savings for low-income households, to improving the level of competition in the banking sector. The committee also uses our regular scrutiny sessions with the Bank of England and the FCA to quiz the regulators on issues relevant to the sector. We've explored the likely impact of open banking and the nature of the competitive threat FinTech poses to the banking sector. And we've examined the stance that the authorities are taking on digital currencies and distributed ledger technology. Indeed, there is one particular aspect of FinTech that the committee is investigating in further detail. We've launched an inquiry into digital currencies and distributed ledger technology, the full terms of reference for which can be found on our website. But broadly speaking, we are seeking to explore the opportunities and the risks brought about by developments in this area and what the government and regulators should be doing in response. And again, I hope that if you do have views on that, because the launch has been met with an enthusiastic reaction from the industry, I'd encourage you to share them with the committee by submitting written evidence to the inquiry. But more generally, and perhaps in conclusion, I can just say this. The Treasury Select Committee is there. We're a critical part of democracy. We're there to quiz ministers, to quiz regulators. For many, this is the way that they're held accountable to Parliament. But we also want to highlight some of the key issues that are out there, the importance of you as a sector to the success of the UK economy. So if there are issues that are important to you, inquiries, please give evidence. If you want to give oral evidence, we will, of course, we'll be delighted to hear from you. So if there are questions and issues that you feel you're not getting enough attention, or there are things that are outstanding that you want to know more, what the regulators and government are going to do, if there's something about the pace of change that you want to highlight to the committee and to Parliament, then open dialogue with us hopefully is going to be key to ensuring that the UK FinTech sector retains its place as a global number one. I wish you all the greatest success, and I hope you have a fantastic couple of days here in London's Guildhall. Thank you.